We're going to get hour two started by taking a look, listen to an interview yesterday on CNBC with one of my favorites from CNBC, Rick Santelli, and Nobel laureate, economic professor Eugene Fama. Remember, this is the guy who said he didn't know what a credit bubble meant. Right? He doesn't understand bubbles. Well, there are a lot of things he doesn't understand, which is why he's now got a Nobel Prize in the very subject that he doesn't understand. See, this proves again that incompetence in economics is a prerequisite to getting a Nobel Prize in economics. And so it makes sense that Eugene Fama is now a Nobel laureate. He can stand in line next to a lot of other economic incompetents who also have that prize. But let's listen to this exchange between Rick Santelli, who basically is more deserving of an economic Nobel Prize than Eugene Fama. He should just hand it over to him. But then again, he's not completely incompetent, so he doesn't even qualify for consideration for a Nobel Prize. But listen to this exchange, because now it starts off, Rick Santelli is asking him about the problem that Janet Yellen is going to have trying to unwind the Fed's $4 trillion balance sheet. And, of course, it's going to be a lot bigger than $4 trillion before they get around to trying to unwind it. But have a listen to his question and, more importantly, Fama's answer to that question. So it's going to start with cut number 10, I believe.
Is Janet Yellen going to ever find the right time, sir? I know that your market efficient work has many issues with it, like irrational exuberance. Are we going to have an irrational interest rate market due to some of the inputs of the Fed?
No, because I think they're basically neutral events. I don't think they do very much.
All right, neutral events. So Rick Santelli is saying, what's going to happen when we have to unwind this massive balance sheet? And his response is, it doesn't matter. It's a neutral event. How could it be neutral? The Fed goes from the biggest buyer of treasuries and mortgage-backed securities to the biggest seller. And that's a neutral event. Now, clearly, it wasn't a neutral event as the Fed was buying up all these bonds. I mean, this was hardly neutral, right? Because buying all these bonds, monetizing all this debt, facilitated a big increase in government spending and artificially suppressed interest rates. So expanding the balance sheet was far from neutral. So if that's the case, how can contracting that same balance sheet be neutral? Right? It's like the drugs make you high, but taking away the drugs doesn't change anything. You can be just as high without the drugs as you are with the drugs. That makes no sense, right? Again, that's why he's got a Nobel Prize. If he made any economic sense, he wouldn't have that Nobel Prize. Let's go on, because it gets worse, or better, depending on your perspective. Here, cut number 11.
When the balance sheet reaches $4 trillion, Professor, I guess my question is, and the economy down the road, both globally and domestically, starts to pick up, if they want to start to control the velocity, wouldn't it be the normal course of action that they would sell securities to pull some of that capital back in? Isn't that normal operating procedure for a central bank?
Sure. But
okay, so what happens when you have $4 trillion of those securities that you start putting back out there to take the money? Isn't that going to poison the well in terms of interest rates moving up dramatically?
Okay, can I answer?
Yeah.
Okay, so they have $4 trillion on one side of the balance sheet, they have $4 trillion on the other. So all they'll do is get rid of one side, retire the reserves, and that will lower the balance of securities that they hold. It's basically a neutral event.
What is he talking about? They have $4 trillion of assets on one side and $4 trillion of assets on the other. No, they don't. They have $4 trillion of assets and $4 trillion of liabilities, but the liabilities are the Federal Reserve notes in circulation. The only assets they have are securities, bonds, mortgages, stuff like that. It's not neutral. He thinks that when the Fed unwinds its balance sheet, it's going to sell some assets and buy other assets. No, it's not. I mean, it's not even close to what they're going to do. Now, where he's so confused, I think, is about Operation Twist, right? Because in Operation Twist, the Federal Reserve sold short-term bonds and bought long-term bonds. That was part of Operation Twist. That's separate from the $85 billion a month in QE we're getting now, right? Because they've already twisted the hell out of their balance sheet. Now they're just growing the balance sheet. But yes, when they had Operation Twist, they were selling some government bonds and buying others. But that's not what's going to happen when they have to shrink their balance sheet. When the Fed has to shrink their balance sheet, all they're doing is selling. They're not buying anything. It's just sell. Yes, in Operation Twist they sold and bought, but what does that have to do with unwinding a $4 trillion balance sheet? Nothing. But somehow he's so confused. Maybe that Nobel Prize is so screwed up his brain. Maybe when you get the Nobel Prize, you get even dumber when it comes, because you just keep, all you see is that Nobel Prize in your head, and maybe the image of the Nobel Prize is so large that whatever else was in your brain just gets squeezed out your ears, so you're even more incompetent. And so he somehow thinks that there's nothing that when they sell their bonds, they're going to be buying some other bonds, so it's a neutral event. They're not going to buy anything. And of course, and he's about to start explaining why this matters. And again, as he explains it, it reveals more how much he doesn't understand. Because he doesn't understand the difference between long-term bonds and short-term bonds. He doesn't even understand the Fed's balance sheet. He has no idea how it's comprised. But he also doesn't understand the difference in the market between long-term bonds and short-term bonds, and how they might react to a large seller or a large buyer in the market. Because he seems to think that if you dump a bunch of 90-day bills on the market, that's going to have the same impact as dumping a bunch of 30-year treasuries on the market. It's not even close, because more people are willing to buy a debt bond that matures in 90 days. I mean, where's the risk there? You get all your money back in 90 days. No big deal, right? Why not buy that? That's not going to be very disruptive to sell a 90-day T-bill. There's plenty of demand for that, and you're not going to get a big change in price because in 90 days, the thing matures at par. The problem is when you're trying to sell a 10-year bond or a 30-year bond, that's where you get a big impact on the market. That's where you get a big drop in price. See, Rick Santelli understands that because he doesn't have a Nobel Prize. Eugene Fama has no clue, because he's got a Nobel Prize. Again, I've said this before with respect to Paul Krugman, but if you could have to give up your economic prize or your Nobel Prize based on saying something so stupid, right? Theoretically, you get the prize for excellence in economics. So if you have a prize and then you say something that's so bad, you theoretically should have to lose the prize, right? For economic idiocy, you got to give it back. The committee should be on the phone demanding that Eugene Fama FedEx back that Nobel Prize right now and return all the money. But of course, they're never going to do that. But I'm going to go and dissect what this guy has to say. And you won't believe this next clip. I mean, this one really maybe is the epitome. But I don't want to give it away. I'm going to play it all, and then I'm going to go back and I'm going to pick it apart piece by piece. But here's the next cut in the series. It's cut number 12.
A little effect on the shape of the term structure, but it's no big deal. It's not like it was in the old days.
So, Professor, let me interrupt you again. So if it's no big deal, then why don't all central banks just do this to the nth degree and make it a constant day-to-day, week-to-week event where they purchase what's issued, keep interest rates low, and just target a low rate forever? Why won't that work then? Why don't we embark on that as a neo-central banking policy?
Well, there's so much confusion in what you said, it's difficult to answer. They haven't been lowering the short rate. They've been putting upward pressure, and it's gone down despite them. So they don't have that much effect on these rates. That's my whole point. And what they're doing now, and just issuing short debt to buy long debt, that's a kind of a nothing act.
So he says that quantitative easing is a nothing activity. It's a neutral event. It's a nothing activity. It's neutral. Then why is the Fed doing it if it's nothing? First of all, he says the Fed is issuing short-term debt to buy long-term debt. That's not what they're doing. First of all, the Fed isn't issuing any debt. It's selling the short-term debt that it owns in order to buy long-term debt. But then it's also net buying long-term debt, selling no short-term debt. Operation Twist is just part of what the Fed is doing. It's not all of what they're doing. But again, they're not issuing that debt. The Treasury issued the debt. The Fed is simply selling the debt that the Fed issued. Now, technically, maybe he's referring to printing Federal Reserve notes as issuing debt. If he says that, well, they're swapping their own debt for Treasury debt, then that would be a true statement, right? Because the Federal Reserve notes are officially liabilities on the books of the Federal Reserve. Now, I don't know that this guy actually understands that or not. I doubt that he does. But assuming that that's what he means, which I don't even think he means that, but if he did mean that, then he would be correct in that they're swapping their own debt for Treasury debt. But it's not short term. See, that's how I know he doesn't mean that, because there's no term at all on Federal Reserve notes, because they don't bear any interest. They don't mature. It's just fiat money. But even if he was referring to that, how could you say that printing money to buy government bonds is a nothing activity? A nothing activity, a non-event? I mean, was it nothing in Zimbabwe when they did it? Was it nothing in the Weimar Republic? Of course it's not nothing. To trivialize what the Fed is doing, to say all they're doing is selling short-term debt and buying long-term debt, if that was all they were doing, their balance sheet wouldn't have grown. The reason the balance sheet is $4 trillion is because they are buying a lot more debt than they're selling. It's not as simple as this Nobel laureate is claiming. They're not just selling and buying, and it's a neutral event. They are buying. It's non-neutral. It's far from neutral. They've got an enormous balance sheet that is impossible to unwind without ushering in an even bigger financial crisis than the last one that this guy admitted he completely didn't understand. He doesn't even know what a bubble is. He doesn't even know how to define one. He has no idea. I mean, is there anything about economics that this guy understands? I mean, or, do you have to understand nothing? If you understand anything, you're disqualified from a Nobel Prize. You got to be a complete moron in the discipline of economics, and then they will give you a Nobel Prize. So he got everything wrong. He doesn't understand the Fed's balance sheet. He doesn't understand the difference between long-term bonds and short-term bonds. He makes the point that the Fed, through Operation Twist, has been selling short-term bonds. And he says that should have made short-term interest rates go up, but it didn't. So therefore, he says that they can sell long-term bonds without making long-term interest rates go up. But those are apples to oranges comparisons. You don't have that much flexibility when it comes to rates on short-term Treasury bills that the Fed is selling, because the maturities are so short. That's why if you're worried about rising interest rates, you don't want to buy a 30-year bond, right? The longer the maturity, the bigger the impact of rising rates. If you've got a bond that matures next week, do you care what happens to interest rates? I mean, it's only going to affect you for a week. Then you got all your money back and you can invest it at higher yields. So if the Fed is going to go into the market and sell short-term treasuries, no big deal. There are plenty of buyers for short-term treasuries. In fact, there were a lot of foreign central banks that had longer-term treasuries that were happy to swap their long-term treasuries for the short-term treasuries that the Fed was unloading, right? The Bank of China, the Bank of Japan, a lot of these foreign central banks welcome the opportunity to shorten the duration of their portfolios. They've got all these dollars in treasuries. They're happy to swap with the Fed lower risk treasuries for high risk treasuries. So that's why, there's no big impact. The problem is going to be when the Fed's got all these longer term securities now, because, in Operation Twist, and again, I called it Operation Screw, but in Operation Twist, they swapped their short-term debt for long-term debt. So now a very high percentage of that $4 trillion balance sheet that this guy says it's no problem to unload, it's a non-event, a large percentage of that is long-term U.S. Treasuries. How is the Fed going to sell those long-term Treasuries without collapsing the market? Who is going to want to buy those Treasuries from the Fed? Nobody. The only way that you're going to find buyers is if you dramatically reduce the price so that the yield is higher. But the problem is the U.S. economy can't survive that because we can't afford to pay the higher yields. The government can't afford it. Our corporations can't afford it. Our homeowners can't afford it. Our whole economy can't afford the higher rates that would come from the Fed trying to unwind that balance sheet. That's why they can't do it. That's why they're never going to do it until a bigger crisis intervenes, right? Which is going to be a currency crisis, which is going to be the collapse of the dollar. But this guy is clueless to all of that. He doesn't see any of it. He doesn't understand anything. He doesn't understand how our monetary system works. He doesn't understand the Fed. He doesn't understand its balance sheet. He doesn't understand QE. He doesn't understand the housing bubble or bubbles in general. He doesn't understand the credit markets. I mean, I can go on and on about all the things he doesn't understand. I mean, I'd like to hear the Nobel Prize Committee tell me what this guy does understand. On what basis does somebody like this have a Nobel Prize in economics, right? I mean, if it really is supposed to be about economic excellence, about, advancing the science of economics, what did this guy do to deserve that? I guess I can't imagine anything that he could have said that would have contributed anything at all to our understanding of economics, because he doesn't understand it himself. He is completely clueless.